I always thought our marriage was built on love, trust, and mutual respect. For 6 years, Hudson and I had what I believed to be a close bond. He was my rock, my confidant, and the person I imagined growing old with. We weren't perfect, no relationship ever is, but I always felt safe with him. Hudson was the type of man who could calm me with a glance, make me laugh when I didn't want to, and reassure me that we were stronger together than apart. But looking back, I realized that trust can be deceptive. Sometimes it hides fractures you can't see until they break wide open. The shift was subtle at first. Hudson had always been open about his fantasies, and I liked that about him. It made me feel like we were partners in every sense of the word. He would share little things during our late-night talks, stories about the dreams he'd had or things he'd read about online. Most of the time, I'd laugh or roll my eyes, teasing him about his wild imagination. It never felt like anything more than harmless chatter. But then one night, Hudson took the conversation in a direction I wasn't prepared for. We were lying in bed, the lights dim, his arm draped over me as we talked about nothing in particular. Out of nowhere, he said, "I've been thinking about something. Something I've never told you before." His tone was different, hesitant, almost vulnerable. It piqued my curiosity. "What is it?" I asked, expecting some quirky confession about a childhood habit or a silly dream he'd had. Instead, he told me he had a fantasy of seeing me with other men watching me be intimate while he stayed on the sidelines. At first, I laughed. I genuinely thought he was joking, but when I turned to look at him, his face was serious. My laughter trailed off, replaced by an awkward silence. I didn't know what to say. "Don't freak out," he said quickly, as if sensing my discomfort. "It's just something I think about. It doesn't mean we have to do it. I wanted to share it with you." I didn't freak out, but I felt uneasy. This wasn't like the playful banter we usually had about his fantasies. This felt more significant, more real. I tried to push the thought aside, chalking it up to Hudson being Hudson, open and honest about things most people would never share. But the words stuck with me, echoing in my mind long after we'd turned off the lights. Over the next few days, I found myself questioning everything. Why would he bring this up now? Was he bored with me? Was there something I wasn't giving him that he was secretly craving? The doubts crept in slowly, but they were relentless. I started scrutinizing our interactions, searching for clues I'd missed. Had he been dropping hints all along? Had I been blind to the signs? At the same time, I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Hudson had always been open with me, and maybe this was just another way of being honest. I didn't have to act on it, he'd said as much. But deep down, a seed of insecurity had been planted, and it was growing fast. Hudson didn't mention it again for a while, but the silence was almost worse. It felt like a shadow hanging over us, a question mark I didn't know how to erase. When he finally brought it up again, I wasn't prepared. We were having dinner, a quiet night at home. Out of nowhere, he said, about what I mentioned the other night. "I just want you to know it's something I've been thinking about for a long time, but I don't want you to feel pressured." His words were gentle, but they carried weight. He wasn't pushing me, but he wasn't letting it go either. It was as if he was planting seeds, testing the waters to see how far I'd go. I tried to brush it off, to steer the conversation in another direction, but he kept circling back. "It's not that I don't love you," he said at one point, his eyes searching mine. "I love you more than anything. This is about us, about exploring something new together." The way he framed it made me feel guilty, as if saying no would mean I wasn't willing to grow with him or support his desires. I hated that feeling. I hated that this man I loved, who I thought I trusted completely, was making me question myself in ways I never had before. I started wondering if there was something wrong with me for feeling so uncomfortable. Maybe I was being too closed-minded. Maybe this was normal and I just didn't understand it. Hudson made it sound so simple, so harmless, but to me it felt like a line I wasn't ready to cross. Still, the thought lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind, leaving me more confused than ever. Hudson didn't let the idea fade, no matter how much I wished he would. After that first conversation, he found ways to weave it into our everyday lives, subtle at first but gradually more persistent. It wasn't overtly forceful, that would have been easier to reject. Instead, it came in the form of casual comments, framed as curiosity or playfulness, leaving me wondering if I was overreacting. One evening, as we were watching TV, a scene came on where a couple discussed their open relationship. Hudson glanced at me with a half smile. "What do you think about that?" he asked casually, as if it were an innocent question. I shrugged, brushing it off. "It's not really my thing," I said, hoping to end the conversation. He didn't push back, but his silence was heavy, like he was waiting for me to say more. Moments like that began to pile up. He wasn't confrontational about it. Instead, he framed it as a way to connect with me on a deeper level. "I just want us to be open about everything," he'd say. "I don't want there to be anything we can't share." It was hard to argue with that. Who doesn't want openness and honesty in a marriage? But the more he brought it up, the more I felt cornered. He wasn't asking for a one-time fantasy anymore. He was making it sound like a pathway to strengthening our bond. And every time I hesitated or pushed back, he seemed disappointed, like I was letting him down. The guilt started creeping in. I began to question myself, wondering if I was being too rigid or unadventurous. Hudson wasn't asking for much, right? He just wanted me to consider it, to be open to the idea. That's what I told myself anyway. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. The worst part was how subtle the pressure was. It wasn't as though he demanded it outright. He'd frame it as a suggestion, a casual idea, leaving me to fill in the gaps. "You don't have to do anything," he'd say, his voice calm and reassuring. But it could be something exciting, something new for us. The way he phrased it made it hard to argue. He wasn't being aggressive or demanding. He was presenting it as an opportunity, something that might even benefit me. And yet, every time he brought it up, my chest tightened. I didn't know how to articulate my discomfort without feeling like I was accusing him of something he hadn't done. It wasn't long before Hudson started testing boundaries in more direct ways. One night, as we were lying in bed, he casually mentioned that he'd been researching the idea online. "You'd be surprised how many couples do this," he said, his tone light. "It's not as taboo as it sounds." I didn't know how to respond. Was he trying to convince me that this was normal, that I was the one being unreasonable? It felt like a game of mental tug-of-war, and I was losing ground with every conversation. He started bringing it up more frequently, always careful to frame it as something for us. It wasn't just his fantasy anymore. It was a shared opportunity, a way to deepen our relationship. "I just want us to try something new," he said one night, his voice almost pleading. "I think it could bring us closer." The guilt hit me like a tidal wave. Hudson wasn't demanding, he was asking. He wasn't angry or impatient, he was calm and loving. How could I say no without feeling like I was letting him down? He made it sound so simple, so harmless, like it was just one step toward a better connection. I started second-guessing myself more and more. Was I the problem? Was I holding us back? I loved Hudson, and the last thing I wanted was to create distance between us. But every time he mentioned it, I felt a knot in my stomach, a warning sign I couldn't ignore. Eventually, I started avoiding the topic altogether. When Hudson brought it up, I'd change the subject or make an excuse to leave the room. But that only seemed to make him more determined. He never got angry, but his persistence was relentless. He'd bring it up at the most unexpected moments, catching me off guard. "You know I'd never force you to do anything," he said one evening, his tone earnest. "I just think it's something worth considering. For us." Those two words, "for us," hung in the air like a challenge. I wanted to believe him, to trust that he had our best interests at heart. But the more he pushed, the more I felt like I was losing control of the situation. I started feeling trapped, like there was no right answer. If I said no, I'd be shutting him down, refusing to meet him halfway. But if I said yes, I couldn't even bring myself to imagine what that would mean. The pressure mounted with every passing day. Hudson didn't have to demand anything outright. His persistence was enough to wear me down. It wasn't forceful, but it was insistent, like a quiet drumbeat I couldn't escape. And the more I resisted, the more I felt like I was failing him as a wife. The night arrived faster than I ever expected, even though I had agreed to it weeks before. I kept hoping Hudson would change his mind, that he'd see how conflicted I was and call the whole thing off. But he didn't. If anything, he seemed more determined than ever, carefully planning every detail while assuring me that I was in complete control. I wasn't. Not really. By the time I had fully understood what I had agreed to, it felt too late to back out. Hudson had chosen the men himself, which only added to my unease. They were strangers' faceless names in his phone until that night. I hadn't spoken to them, hadn't chosen them, hadn't even been part of the conversation. This was his arrangement, his fantasy. I was just there. As I got ready, my hands trembled so badly I could barely apply my makeup. Hudson noticed and came into the bathroom, placing his hands gently on my shoulders. "You don't have to do this," he said softly, looking at me in the mirror. But his words felt hollow. After weeks of persistent nudges and carefully placed reassurances, I knew that saying no now would be met with disappointment, no matter how much he tried to hide it. So I nodded, forcing a weak smile. "It's fine," I lied. When the doorbell rang, my heart sank. Hudson opened the door with an ease that stunned me. He greeted them like old friends, laughing and chatting as if this were the most natural thing in the world. I stayed in the bedroom, unable to face them, my mind racing with thoughts of how I had ended up here. When Hudson called for me to come out, my legs felt like lead. Each step toward the living room was agonizing, every muscle in my body begging me to turn around and run. But I didn't. I was too far in, too overwhelmed by a mix of guilt, fear, and resignation. The men were polite, almost overly so. They smiled and introduced themselves, their calm demeanor at odds with the storm raging inside me. I could barely look at them, my eyes fixed on the floor as I mumbled a greeting. Hudson, on the other hand, was completely at ease. He poured drinks, made small talk, and acted as though this were a casual get-together. But it wasn't casual for me. It was surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold in slow motion. Everything felt distant and wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't belong here, that this wasn't my life or my choice. When the moment came, it was as if I had left my body. I wasn't present, I was disconnected, watching from somewhere far away. Hudson sat back, exactly as he said he would, his eyes never leaving me. The weight of his gaze was unbearable, a constant reminder that this wasn't about me, it was about him. Every second felt like an eternity. There was no intimacy, no connection, no meaning in what was happening. It was mechanical, detached, and humiliating. The strangers were respectful in their own way, but their presence only amplified my discomfort. I wasn't a person to them, I was a participant in someone else's fantasy. Hudson's expressions of approval, the occasional encouraging word, made it worse. He seemed so pleased, so satisfied, as though this was everything he had hoped for. But I felt like I was disappearing, like pieces of me were being stripped away with every passing moment. When it was finally over, I wanted nothing more than to be alone. I excused myself to the bathroom, locking the door behind me and sinking to the floor. My body felt foreign, like it didn't belong to me anymore. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, shame, anger, regret, and a deep, aching sadness. Hudson knocked gently on the door after a while. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft and full of concern. I didn't answer. How could I? I wasn't okay, and I wasn't sure if I ever would be. Sitting there on the cold bathroom floor, I realized something profound. I had crossed a line I never thought I would, and I didn't even know who I was anymore. When I finally emerged, the men were gone. Hudson looked at me with a mix of excitement and concern, as if he couldn't decide whether to celebrate or comfort me. I couldn't look at him. Without saying a word, I went to the bedroom and closed the door behind me. That night, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and replaying everything in my mind. I felt hollow, like I had left pieces of myself behind in that living room. Hudson had gotten what he wanted, but I had lost something far more valuable, my sense of self. The morning after was unbearable. I woke up to the sound of Hudson moving around the kitchen, humming as though it were just another day. The sunlight streaming through the curtains felt too bright, too invasive, like it was exposing everything I was trying to hide. I stayed in bed, hoping to delay the inevitable, the moment I'd have to face him, the moment I'd have to confront what had happened. I eventually forced myself to get up, but every movement felt heavy. My body was sore, not just physically but emotionally, like the weight of the previous night had seeped into my bones. When I walked into the kitchen, Hudson turned to me with a broad smile. "Morning," he said cheerfully, as if nothing had changed. I managed a weak nod, avoiding his gaze. He handed me a cup of coffee and kissed me on the cheek, his casual affection a stark contrast to the turmoil inside me. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his tone light but probing. How was I feeling? I didn't even know where to begin. Part of me wanted to scream, to tell him how broken I felt, how violated. But another part of me, the part that had been conditioned by weeks of his subtle pressure, felt like I didn't have the right to be upset. I had agreed to this, hadn't I? "I'm fine," I lied, my voice barely above a whisper. Hudson seemed to take my answer at face value, nodding with a satisfied expression. "I think it went really well," he said, his voice brimming with enthusiasm. "You were incredible." The words made my stomach churn. I forced myself to take a sip of coffee, hoping it would steady me, but the taste was bitter, just like the moment. Hudson continued talking, reflecting on the night as though it were some great adventure we'd embarked on together. He used words like connection and trust as if what had happened was a testament to our love. But I didn't feel connected to him. If anything, I felt further away than ever before. His excitement only deepened the chasm between us, making me realize just how differently we were experiencing this. For him, it was a triumph of fantasy fulfilled. For me, it was a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I went through the motions, doing chores and answering Hudson's questions with monosyllabic responses, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept replaying the events of the night, dissecting every moment, every choice, every emotion. I felt like a stranger in my own life, like I had been plucked from my reality and dropped into someone else's story. That evening, Hudson suggested we talk about it. He said it casually, like it was no big deal, but the idea filled me with dread. I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to revisit what had happened, but I didn't know how to say no without causing a fight, so I reluctantly agreed. We sat on the couch, and Hudson launched into a detailed recap of the night. He talked about how proud he was of me, how he felt it had brought us closer. "I knew you'd handle it beautifully," he said, his tone warm and approving. His words felt like daggers. Handle it. Was that what this was to him, a task to be managed, a performance to be critiqued? I stayed silent, staring at my hands as he continued to speak. Eventually, he noticed my lack of response. "What's wrong?" he asked, his brow furrowing in concern. For a moment, I considered telling him everything, how hurt and betrayed I felt, how much I regretted agreeing to this. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw genuine confusion. He didn't understand. He truly believed that this had been a positive experience for both of us. "It's nothing," I said finally, forcing a smile. "I'm just tired." Hudson nodded, seemingly satisfied with my answer, and wrapped his arm around me. "I'm so glad we did this," he said, his voice soft. "I feel like it's opened up a whole new chapter for us." His words echoed in my mind long after he had gone to bed. A new chapter, was that what this was? Because to me, it felt like the closing of a door, one I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to reopen. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I realized I couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. I didn't know how to fix this, but I knew I couldn't go on like this. Something had shifted irreparably between us, and I wasn't sure if we could ever find our way back. In the days that followed, I began to feel the weight of everything I had been suppressing. At first, I told myself I could move on, that this was just a bump in the road. Hudson seemed so content, so certain that what we had done had strengthened our bond, and I thought that maybe if I tried hard enough I could see it the way he did. But the truth was impossible to ignore. Every time I looked at him, I felt a mix of anger, sadness, and something far worse, resentment. Hudson continued to act as though nothing had changed, but for me, everything had. I began pulling away in ways I didn't even realize at first. Conversations became shorter, touches felt forced, and the intimacy that once came so naturally between us now felt like a chore. I didn't know how to be close to him anymore, not after what had happened. At night, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling and replaying every detail of that evening in my mind. I felt ashamed not just of what had happened, but of myself. I hated that I had let it happen, that I had ignored every instinct telling me to say no. And I hated that Hudson, the man I loved and trusted, had put me in a position where I felt like I couldn't refuse. I started questioning everything about our relationship. Was this really the man I thought I knew? The man who claimed to love and cherish me? If he truly cared about me, how could he have been so blind to my discomfort? Or worse, how could he have seen it and pushed forward anyway? The realization that our marriage wasn't as strong as I believed was devastating. I had always thought of us as a team, a partnership built on mutual respect and trust. But now, that foundation felt cracked and unstable. I couldn't stop wondering if Hudson had always been this way and I just hadn't noticed. Had I missed the signs, or had this part of him only emerged recently? One afternoon, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, staring at nothing in particular. The house was eerily quiet, and for the first time in weeks, I let myself really feel everything I had been holding back. The sadness, the anger, the regret, it all came rushing to the surface, overwhelming me like a tidal wave. I started crying, the kind of deep, guttural sobs that leave you gasping for air. I cried for the woman I used to be, the woman who had trusted her husband completely. I cried for the love I thought we shared, the love that now felt tainted and unrecognizable. And I cried for the future I had imagined for us, a future that now felt impossibly far away. Hudson found me there, curled up on the couch with tears streaming down my face. For a moment, he looked genuinely concerned. "What's wrong?" he asked, sitting down beside me and placing a hand on my back. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him everything that was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I shook my head, wiping at my face and muttering, "I'm just tired." He didn't push me, and for that I was grateful. But his presence only made me feel worse. I couldn't look at him without remembering what he had asked of me, what I had allowed to happen for his sake. The resentment was like a poison, seeping into every part of our relationship. Over the next few weeks, I began to withdraw even more. I avoided Hudson whenever I could, throwing myself into work and making excuses to spend time away from home. When we were together, the tension between us was palpable, though Hudson seemed either oblivious or unwilling to address it. One night, as I lay awake in bed, I realized something that shook me to my core. I didn't trust him anymore. Trust had always been the cornerstone of our relationship, the thing that made me feel safe and secure. Without it, I felt adrift, unsure of where we stood or where we were headed. I knew I couldn't go on like this, but I didn't know how to fix it. Part of me wanted to confront Hudson, to tell him everything I was feeling and demand answers. But another part of me was terrified that he wouldn't understand, or worse, that he wouldn't care. In the end, I realized that the answers didn't lie with Hudson, they lay with me. I had to figure out what I wanted, what I needed, and whether this marriage could still be salvaged. It wasn't an easy decision, and I didn't have all the answers. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope, not for our relationship, but for myself. I didn't know where the road ahead would lead, but I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. It was time to take control of my life again, to rebuild the parts of myself that I had lost. Whether Hudson would be part of that journey remained to be seen, but I knew that, no matter what, I had to start putting myself first.